going to use the slides as my speaking notes, and everyone can have access to these as we go along and later as well, if you wish. There's nothing really proprietary here. So let's get started. What I wanted to do was, I'm going to try and get started here. There we go. An overview of what we wanted to do. Initially, I thought I might do not talk about the coronavirus and just talk about all the other things going on in the world. But as I'm sure all of you who keep up with the news have discovered, that it doesn't make any difference what part of the world we're talking about. The dominant news story, 99% of all the articles, if you might Google, is going to be about the coronavirus. So we'll start with that, on where we stand and where this might go. And then we've got, I guess, about 9 different slides that will take a look at different issues. Much of it is regional, and again, the dominant issue is what's going on with the coronavirus. But underlying that is highlighting some of the political and economic challenges that are going to be there when all this is over. So it isn't just an issue of test kits and face masks and lockdowns and ventilators and all those kinds of things. And I'm not going to talk really about the state in the U.S., because if you turn on any cable news channel, that's what you get 24/7. So this is really a global perspective. At the end of this, we'll have a Q&A, and I trust we'll still have a good time for Q&A. And I know you're not shy, and we'll get off the mute at that point and either have a conversation by voice or a conversation by chat and email. So let's get started. The first thing is on the virus, where we stand, and you probably won't be surprised to discover I will interchangeably call this thing the coronavirus or COVID-19. I refuse to call it the Chinese virus, because those who do have another agenda, which has more to do about China than it has to do about a virus and where it started. We are now roughly 800,000 total cases in the world. With I just look at this. Spell check won't catch this. Over 40,000 deaths, not deaths. My gosh, 40,000 deaths. If you do the math, that's a 5% mortality rate. You read about 1% mortality rates projected for this virus, and there's an asterisk here because we don't really know how many total cases there are. In a lot of societies, there is very little testing, including our own. In a lot of societies, there's a lot more testing, but it's catch as catch can. And frankly, outside of China and East Asia, the societies are not doing widespread testing. And when we get to talk about India and Pakistan later, with roughly 1.5 billion people in South Asia, at least, that's another major issue. So these numbers have to be taken as low, not the number of deaths, not deaths, but the number of total cases is really low in the tally, because we just don't know how many other cases are out there that haven't been tested. We also know that, at least from the testing that has been done, that something on the order of 40 to 50% of those who test positive are not symptomatic. So, and unless you've been really careful in yourself, for the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, excuse me, we never know. The United States, I've got a frog in my throat here, just a second. The United States has twice the total number of Chinese cases, and is now, just as of, let me get rid of this. I'm going to mute myself for just a second and clear my throat here. Okay, maybe that's better. Sorry about that. It's just sinuses. It's nothing of what we're talking about here. We have now surpassed the number of Chinese deaths and obviously also surpassed the number of US deaths on 9/11. And I think that's telling in the United States. The one thing I will say about our situation is that there is belatedly in many quarters, in most quarters, a recognition that this is really something to be taken seriously. And I say that even though this is about a global perspective, some parts, as we go through this, you'll see that some parts of the world are taking this very seriously, and other parts of the world are not at all. And that's really what gives me pause about where this goes in the long term. The Chinese curve is relatively flat. We are exponentially rising. But if you look at other places around the world as we go through this, you see that a whole lot of other places, including very populated parts of the world, are only beginning to see this curve. I'm going to try and, well, I don't know if I can do that or not. I was going to, if you can see my cursor down here, these are, the blue is cases outside mainland China. The Chinese cases by the end of March have pretty much leveled off. The rest of the world, and much of that is US and Europe and Iran, is on an exponential growth curve. And as we see with this, there's going to be a whole lot of places in the world where that exponential growth hasn't even started yet, but it will start. I'll come back to this a little bit later when we talk about Europe, but just a couple of statistics, morbid ones. Mortality per capita is highest in Italy and Spain. But interestingly, the case per capita cases is highest in small and medium European countries like Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg, and really high because of small populations in places like Andorra and Monaco and Liechtenstein, which all, by the way, happen to border on Italy or Spain, if not both of them. So that's just a little a snippet on that. The real issues, we are looking at exponential growth of this all over the world. You'll see that as we go through this. No one really knows how the duration of this will go, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere. Even in China, where it's relatively flat, and elsewhere in East Asia, they put in some draconian measures because as Chinese begin to go back to work and Chinese begin to come back into the country when they were left, unable to return to their countries before, same with Japan and South Korea and Singapore, although a smaller population, there is now a concern that there will be a second wave within those countries as a result of travelers coming back. And then, of course, this thing may be seasonal, and I have not seen anything that suggests a vaccine available anytime before sometime mid to late next year. So that's kind of where we stand. The next thing I want to say a little bit about, and a lot of you are very much involved in this and know a lot more about this than I do as you watch markets and deal with money issues, is the economic impact of this. As we all know, global markets are down about 25%. I think the US markets are down about 21%, but global markets are down about 25% since year end. We've got about 10% GDP tagged into this recovery effort, and I think it's going to be I don't know how much bigger percentage it's going to be before it's all over. The Chinese economy is contracted 10%. China, as you've read, perhaps is going, quote, back to work. But in the words of that immortal Hertz Rent-A-Car ad, not exactly. There are a lot of people who are not yet going back to work. There's a lot of rhetoric about the economy starting up and gearing up, but that is just beginning. And there's a lot of reticence about coming back out and getting into large groups. Another theme that you're going to see as we go through this regionally, particularly about developing world, is, and there's a lot of things that have been written about this over the last few days, if you're interested, is the long-term impact on the poorest economies of the world, in a world in which over the last 30 years, as we've talked in other programs, both within affluent societies and within the world at large, is that those economies, those portions of the populations that are very wealthy have been getting much wealthier before all this happened. and those that weren't wealthy were getting poorer and poorer. This income inequality gap that has been widening for the past 25 to 30 years as a result of a lot of trends associated with globalization. This is going to be a real gut punch, I think, for all of that. If you think about the revenue sources in most of the poorest economies in the world, it tends to be tourism, commodities, and foreign investment, which keeps them afloat with large debts. And the tourism is basically dead. I would be on a cruise right now, but I'm not. And my one in June and July just got canceled as well. So this is not going to end anytime quickly. Hotels are empty. Tourism is down, obviously. Commodities, including oil, but also agricultural products that need to be processed and shipped and so on, minerals and so on. A lot of the, but oil, especially, as everyone knows, we are at an 18-year low on the price of oil. It is lower than it was in about 8 or 9 years ago, but 7 years ago when it got down to about $30 a barrel. I think we're now below $20 a barrel. I didn't check this morning. And then, of course, the other thing that emerging markets depend on is foreign investment, not handouts, but foreign investment. And that investment is being pulled back as investors try to hold on to cash and are not actually keen about throwing money into markets that aren't going to be producing. At the same time, increasing expenses, obviously, healthcare costs. How do you keep workers out of poverty when they're not able to work? And if they do borrow, they're going to have to borrow at higher interest rates if you don't have good credit ratings. Those of us, and I count myself fortunate in this, with good credit ratings, I can go out and borrow a lot of money at virtually no interest at this point. Not that I'm gonna. But if you don't have a good credit rating, if you've got a history of indebtedness like so many developing countries in the world, like much of Latin America, for example, you're going to pay a premium on that borrowing. So this is not going to get better anytime soon. Whoops. Still getting used to this software, so bear with me. Politically, the other issue that is becoming increasingly interesting in an intellectual sense to me, but concerning as well, is the return of big government. There's a very nice piece in this week's Economist, if you haven't seen it yet, that summarizes a lot of these issues, but there are a lot of things that have been written about this over the past few days and the last couple of weeks. Certainly the United States, when you're investing 10% of GDP into a bailout plan or national emergency response plan, then we're talking about big government, certainly. It is both good and bad. It is something that one does in the wake of national emergencies. And what's interesting is that this national emergency really ranks up there with anything that is well above anything that has happened to this country and indeed to the rest of the world since World War II. And in terms of pandemics, global pandemics, probably you have to go back 100 plus years to the 1918, 1919 influenza. And that governments can do things that others can't. It can muster national resources. It can impose travel and commercial restrictions. And you can, I'm repeating myself here, greater political cooperation to fight a common enemy. The real danger, and somebody can, maybe get a free World Affairs Council program if you can identify the gentleman in the picture through a note to Karen. But the danger, if there are no checks and balances on government, and so much of the world that even has checks and balances and pluralism and something akin to a democratic process, those institutions can be very fragile. We'll see as we go through this in a number of places where opposition to the government, dissent on policies, much less things like I'm not even talking about things like breaking quarantine, subjects you to criminalization, and you can restrict assembly, political mobilization, and we have a debate in this country about voter access. We have an election in November. we have primaries between now and then, but the real issue is an election in November. And I don't think anybody has any sense of what we're going to be doing. There's a consensus we should be voting by mail, but we've got 50 states and the District of Columbia and a handful of others that have to all make that happen, and that isn't happening yet. And the other thing that we see that this pandemic is doing is allowing groups that want to stoke fears of other things to conflate the pandemic with other things, whether it's Mexicans at the border or Chinese who brought the virus to us, if they supposedly, or as we'll see in India, a resurgence of Indian or Hindu Muslim tensions. Political leaders will take these things and turn them to their own devices. That we can count on. So now let's start with some regional scans. These will be reasonably quickly. And again, as you've already known, I mean, the slide pretty much says what I'm going to talk about. I think, as you all know, the Schengen zone, which is most of the EU, including other places that are not in the EU, like Switzerland and Norway, this borderless, passport-free, visa-free travel zone. The EU and the Schengen authorities imposed this travel ban in the middle of the March. It's supposed to go for 30 days. I've got a big red question mark there because my guess is that, like all of these restrictions that are put on a 30-day or so leash, those will get extended. In most cases, countries were already doing that unilaterally. So this was simply a recognition of, let's make this common within Europe. There is an exception to truck traffic. So just as in the United States and elsewhere and other places in Europe, the world moves by truck. Truck traffic is what keeps everything stocked up in the stores and all the rest of it. So, so it's key. Most countries in Europe, excuse me, are stay at home. Sweden is an interesting exception if you've been reading a little bit about that. The Swedes, and there's been a few interesting pieces about cultural exceptionalism. Swedes pretty much do things voluntarily, and when the government suggests they do something, they pretty much do it. But pubs and restaurants are open, but they haven't been experiencing this explosion. But there does appear to be a lot of voluntary cooperation with guidelines and restrictions, as opposed to in other countries a mandatory, we're shutting down everything in the process. So that's an interesting exception, although I think Sweden will find itself increasingly enforcing things as this goes forward. Most every country has their own stimulus packages, and the European Central Bank did one in mid-March, criticized as too little, perhaps never too late. The EU made a forecast about a week or so ago that economic output will contract by 1% in Europe. I think there's a big red question mark there as well. I think that's an understatement. In the long term, Europe, which has been plagued, particularly countries like Italy and Spain, has been plagued with high debt and currency problems within the EU and so on. Basically, all those concerns are being put to the side at the moment, and the real issue is to defeat this virus and deal with the expenses, and then deal with the recovery later. So we will be seeing, I think, in years in the future, a lot of efforts within the European Union to hold the union together, which I think it will, if nothing else, except by inertia, but to address these issues. And of course, the biggest social challenge is there's no football and no pubs. On a lighter note, as I did say earlier, the hardest hit are Italy and Spain, but then countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, Switzerland, Austria, Andorra, Liechtenstein, or so on, have some of those really small ones have higher death rates per capita. And then the Bête Noire in Europe, if anybody sent their email to Karen already, that was Viktor Orban of Hungary that I had on the previous slide, whose parliament just offered him a decree that he asked for that essentially gives him emergency powers to sideline parliament, to do whatever he wants to do. There is no expiration on this. There is no constitutional check on this. There is no opportunity really for any opposition unless there is a radical change in Hungarian politics. That there is really no expiration date on this. So Orban had wanted this in any event. This is now his attempt to criminalize anyone who, which the law provides for, criminalization of dissenting journalistic attitudes, shutting down dissidents, and so on. This is very concerning. A lot of people have begun to liken this to the Enabling Act in the Reichstag in 1933 that gave unlimited powers to Hitler through quote unquote constitutional means. So this is part of the political implications that we're seeing here. And I think this is not the only place that we need to worry about this. In Russia, they have been arguing that they are under control, and Putin says, you know, we got this covered. Something that other political leaders have also mentioned. They did respond quickly to close the border in the end of January and have quarantine zones. There's been some sporadic testing, but not a lot. What's curious about Russia is that even though the government has been saying, you know, these are some of the things we should be doing, and social distancing and so on, a lot of the things I'm reading suggest that there's the widespread distrust of government, means that if the government says something, nobody believes it. So you still have pictures of, you know, there's not a lockdown. So it hasn't been a lockdown. So you have pictures of the Moscow subway being flooded with people, and people going out and doing all of the things, particularly in the large cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. There is a bit of a different tune as of about a week or so ago. There's now a new law from the Duma that says disinformation. This is kind of ironic, perhaps, but disinformation can get you 5 years in prison if you publish it. There is now a citywide quarantine in Moscow and a stay-at-home order in St. Petersburg, and then in regions around. But basically, regions have been left to themselves to decide what it is that they're going to do. The other interesting thing is that Putin's senior medical advisor is now tested positive, and Putin, who until about a week or so ago was out there almost every day giving good news, he has been largely out of the public eye for the last week. Not necessarily, I just haven't seen any reports that he is ill, but that people shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, he only wants to give out good news, and so if there's no good news, he's not going to be doing that. So stay tuned and watch that. Russia is a place where, although a smaller population than other parts of the world, and certainly it has concentrations of population, and this may just be the beginning of something in which too little was done and not soon enough. Like so many other issues in the rest of the world, other business is pretty much not on the agenda. As we've talked before in other programs, the New START agreement expires and can be renewed in 2021, but there really wasn't much interest in either Washington or Moscow to move forward. Less interest in Washington than there was in Moscow, but none of that is even on the agenda at this point. It's just one of the things that those of us who have worked in government know, that there's only so much bandwidth in government and within the bureaucracy and amongst the decision-making class that when you have something like this, almost nothing else can be focused on. In the middle of all of this, of course, this was still when there was a good news story coming out of Moscow and the Kremlin. Mr. Putin had launched this idea of maybe I'd like to stay president after 2024. And so one of his allies in the Duma, the parliament, put forward a proposal about how to do this constitutionally. And they essentially are going to say, we're just going to reset your term count back to 0. We're not going to change the Constitution that says you can't have more than 2 consecutive terms. We're just going to pretend that you're starting at 0 again. The Constitutional Court, never wanting to disapprove of anything the Kremlin wanted, approved this a couple of weeks ago. And now there needs to be this needs to be passed in a public referendum. That was set for 22 April and is now going to be postponed without a date set that I could find. Asia is under control, and I use that phrase in 2 senses. One, that the virus seems to be in a number of countries, China, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Singapore, is pretty much under control, barring any reinfection as travelers come back in, and I've come to that. But it is also an area where the societies are under control. And that's not just authoritarian countries like China, but also democratic ones like Korea. Maybe this has to do with a preference for collectivism over individual privacy. That's probably playing into it in one way or another. China's curve has leveled. Theirs was a very draconian total social control. And they are now beginning to lift business restrictions. But again, maintaining a lot of controls over the society as they begin to let Chinese that were overseas and not able to come back home, including Min Shinpei here at Colorado College, there is going to be a concern about reinfection from those who have been overseas in infected countries and bringing something back. So we can expect reestablishment of some social controls and certainly some draconian quarantine measures. In Hong Kong, very small number of cases and a small number of deaths. An interesting case, very much attuned to what happened in the 2003 SARS case, in which Hong Kong had a lot more, we got hit really hard from immigrate as the virus made its way from mainland China into Hong Kong. So they have been very much on high alert. Medical system has been on high alert. They've also had very well established protocols after the SARS epidemic that they put in place early on. Cited 97% of the population use face masks. Of course, it's ironic because you'll remember that during the protests at the end of last year, that was one of the things that people were doing, is wearing face masks in the protests. Excuse me. They were using face masks in the protests to remain anonymous to all the cameras that were watching their faces and doing facial recognition technology to figure out who was protesting. And there are no restrictions on testing in Hong Kong. So there's been a widespread, I don't know what the number is, but widespread testing and a system that has really responded well to this. In South Korea, the curve shot up very quickly and then flattened very quickly, again, with early intervention, massive testing, and now production and export of test kits around the world. They have been doing things like tracing contacts and phone alerts. So if someone in your neighborhood tests positive for the virus, everyone in that neighborhood gets an alert to hunker down. And they're using apps on phones and so on, ankle bracelets and so on, to monitor those who are put into quarantine. And that leads us to the issue of how do you keep people under control? And then that raises the question as to whether or not those measures are going to remain when this is all over as a new normal, as we understand the use of social media in keeping societies, if not under control, at least reducing people's privacy. Most of these countries have barred all foreign visitors. South Korea had a 14-day quarantine. Japan had blocked anyone coming from China, and a lot of other countries recently blocked anyone coming from Europe, is considering blocking anybody coming from the United States. I think that's just that's just Japan wanting to block the virus. I don't see any political connotation in all of that. But again, we have these technologies that are being used. Singapore phone location, you have to report your location to authorities. And one of the ways you do that is by having your phone send data to police and other authorities as to where you are. That allows the major database to track people, to know who's been talking to whom, who's been meeting with whom, and if you're under quarantine, whether you've been breaking quarantine. In Hong Kong, they are using ankle bracelets for quarantine and tracking people. And if people break quarantine, then they are fined heavily and subject to imprisonment. If in Taiwan, if you turn your phone off and can no longer track transmit your data to some authority as to where you are, the police will visit you at your home to find out that whether you've turned your phone off. So you can imagine that some of these, or cannot imagine really, some of these technologies being introduced in the United States. But then the United States is a lot more prideful of individual privacy than in many other countries, particularly in Asia. There have been other, North Korea, who knows what the virus is doing in North Korea, because there's no information coming out of that. But Kim Jong-un has been, and perhaps we should have a separate presentation by Bill Berry to talk more about this. So this is just a sketch. They did conduct 9 short-range missile tests in the month of March. They were short-range missiles. They landed somewhere, not quite, if you can see my cursor, somewhere in this ocean between North Korea and Japan's exclusive economic zone. So it wasn't like some of the other ones that were launched across the tip of Japan, brought into the broader ocean of the Pacific. So it wasn't launched at anybody. This is a new missile that was tested in August. It replaces another missile that was a lot older. It ultimately will have about a 400-kilometer or 250-mile range. So again, this is a missile that is useful for hitting South Korea and for Japan, but not Guam. Those are other missiles that they had tested before. This is a high frequency for them. They hadn't been doing, they haven't really tested this many in a short period of time for about 4 years. But they are still somewhat complying with the agreements they made in Singapore. They haven't done any long-range or nuclear weapons tests since November of 2017. They haven't done any new weapons tests. They didn't do any of those tests in 2018. Now, this doesn't mean that they're all as good, because even short-range ballistic missile tests have been banned by the UN Security Council. And in the meantime, we've had this conversation, and that's all I'll call it, is a conversation, an occasional exchange of letters between Trump and Kim Jong-un. When Kim Jong-un started testing these missiles, short-range missiles, back in the summer and fall of 2019, everyone, the Japanese and the South Koreans got excited about it. The UN got excited about it, but Trump said he was, it was okay. It was only short-range stuff. It didn't really matter. So Kim Jong-un continues to cite Trump's, quote, approval of all of this. There is no progress on on any denuclearization conversation. Every time Mr. Pompeo says something, Trump and Kim Jong-un says, I want to talk to Mr. Trump because we have a great relationship. Pompeo is the scum of the earth, and we don't want to deal with him. So that is where that issue stands still today. I just added this this morning. The more I thought about it, as I had pulled this presentation together, it occurred to me that I had left out about for something like 1 out of 5 of the world's population in India and in Pakistan. So just threw this together this morning, and this is really the question that I would ask, invite you all to think about and to watch. Is this the next big regional explosion? I mean, we'll talk a little bit about Latin America and Africa, which are also very concerning in many ways. But in India and Pakistan, you have, in a sense, the beginning of a perfect storm. Largely, if for no other reason than the huge masses of population that are at play here, and the politics of the governments in concern. And if we begin to see exponential growth of the virus in these countries, this could get really bad, really ugly, really quickly. India has low reported numbers, but that's because they've been downplaying it, not because they actually don't have a lot of cases. They did have a huge hotspot in mid-March because of a Muslim convention that was held, and there were, I think, 100 cases that came out of that. And this fueled a lot of anti-Muslim riots amongst the Hindu communities over what's been dubbed the Corona Jihad. And of course, as you know, there have been a lot of anti-Muslim and anti-Hindu riots and violence in cities in India over the last year, quite independent of the virus and before then. So this simply plays into all of that. It was only last week that that Prime Minister Modi announced a national lockdown, contemplate a national lockdown of 1.3 billion people, and that'll leave you awake at night, which is, fine in terms of a policy. Lockdowns are good in this, right? Except that you've got millions, tens of millions of people who are migrant workers. They come into the cities. They live in their village. They come from outside rural villages. They're sending money home. They have come in to work in factories. They've come in to work in shops and restaurants to do migrant labor. These are impoverished people who have now lost their income, and they are going home. And they are going home having been exposed to who knows what. And now they're going back into rural villages where this virus has not yet really surfaced. It occurs to me that a significant transmission of the disease from densely populated urban centers with workers who've been living in pretty squalid conditions, making their way back to rural villages, that the growth of this virus is inevitable, it seems to me. So watch it. And public health expenditures, 1.3% of GDP, I read this morning, and as you can see, I put this slide together quickly. I meant to say one of the world's lowest, not lowers. So this is what happens when you pull these things together and don't proofread them enough. This is a perfect storm, it seems to me. That hasn't been given a lot of attention in the media, that a country of 1.3 billion people could well find itself exploding in a way that makes China look very meek, without the social controls that China has, as to whether India will be able to deal with this. In Pakistan, similarly, a much smaller population of 220 million people, but that's 2/3 of the United States. But here you've got one of the deniers, and he's not the only one in the world, Imran Khan, who has discounted the threat. He's bragged, no case, we don't have any cases. There wasn't any testing. He rejected ideas of a lockdown. He said, yeah, we should do social distancing, but go back to work in your factories, which are crowded, and shops that are squalid, and so on. So like a lot of others, slowly beginning to understand that maybe this is a problem as the virus really began to take off in some of the large urban centers. And last week, the military said, to heck with you, Imran Khan, we're taking over. Didn't take over the government, but they just they worked with regional governments and have established regional lockdowns, and the military is enforcing them, notwithstanding Imran Khan. But you do have a couple of things. You have medical personnel who have said, I'm not going to work because of the situation. There's no protection, there's no capacity, and I'm not going to go in and get sick. But then you have Muslim clerics in Pakistan who are refusing to close their mosques and insisting on having Friday prayer services in crowded mosques, arguing that God would not forgive them if they continued to do this if they didn't have their mosque services on Friday. So again, another, maybe not as much the perfect storm as India, but the ingredients of an explosion of cases in this part of the world that is not a lot of people paying a lot of attention to at the moment is something for us to watch. In the middle of all this, we've been having some conversations, quite apart from the virus, about a peace deal in Afghanistan. So just to take you back to last September, as you may recall, there was a draft peace deal, and the U.S. would withdraw about 5,400, which is almost half. About I'm going to say, what do we have now? About 13,000 there now. We would withdraw 5,400 people, soldiers, in 20 weeks. The Taliban would have to promise that they would not allow Afghanistan to be a base for terrorist attacks. And Mr. Trump announced that he would have a meeting at Camp David, but then there was a Taliban attack on the embassy and forces, U.S. forces in Kabul, and there was a lot of blowback on that agreement. And Trump announced that those talks were dead. The talks weren't really dead. Our special envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad, who is Afghan himself, born in Afghanistan, has been working with the Taliban quietly in the intervening months. And there was supposedly an agreement that was penciled in, and these conversations have been going on in Qatar, that there would be a deal. Khalilzad said there were some secret annexes that would allow the United States to maintain a small counterterrorism force in Afghanistan. This was going to be a secret annex because the Taliban was certainly not going to publicly agree that U.S. forces would stay in Afghanistan. But of course, then as soon as people started reporting about secret annexes and Khalilzad began mentioning about secret annexes that were going to allow this, Taliban said, no, they're not. They're not going to have any secret annexes. We're not going to allow U.S. forces to remain. So all of that pretty much went on the side. In the midst of all of that, we also had elections in Afghanistan, and Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah Abdullah, I called it Abdullah squared, Abdullah, they are longtime rivals. Ghani is the current president, Abdullah, and on the picture there, this is Ghani on the left, and Abdullah with the bald head. They are they both ran for election. They both accused the others of cheating, and each one of them announced that they had won. And they have refused to cooperate with each other. They don't have to cooperate with each other as part of the peace deal. In fact, interestingly enough, the Afghan government is not part of this peace deal. One of the more controversial aspects of this is that the Afghan government is that the peace deal is between the United States and the Taliban. which is ironic given that we had never recognized the Taliban, and that was why we threw them out in the first place. But the Afghan, the deal was supposed to be the prerequisite of what would then be meetings between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And Pompeo thought he had something in place after the February 2020 deal, that there would be a meeting in Doha, Qatar. But on March 28th, the Taliban delegation said, we refuse to meet with the Afghan delegation, that they aren't inclusive enough of all of the parties, and we don't view this government as legitimate. So a lot of things have begun to unravel. There was supposed to be a prisoner swap yesterday, didn't happen. 5,000 Taliban arrests, in return for the release of 1,000 Afghan security forces that the Taliban are holding. As far as I know, that prisoner swap never happened. And U.S. force withdrawals, that's really an interesting question. In some respects, it had already begun. We have 13,000 troops. I don't know how much we're going to plan to go down to. That too is on hold because whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or in Europe or anywhere else in the world, U.S. forces coming back in the United States immediately go into a 14-day quarantine. So for the most part, military are not on the move, except for a carrier. That's another issue. Where this all goes, basically, it seems to me where all this is going to go is there may or may not be a Taliban-U.S. deal. The U.S. has made clear, both Pompeo and Trump have made clear that the United States is going to pull out, and with them, of course, whatever coalition forces remain in Afghanistan, they'll leave too. They were already leaving. And that if the whole thing breaks down and the Taliban take over and it reverts to a pre-9/11 state, we'll just blame Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah and the Afghan political leadership for their inability to get their act together. We've already tried to make that point by a $1 billion aid cut to Afghanistan last month, and there will be more cuts down the road as well. So that conversation continues, but I can't say that there's any progress. Last couple of slides here. Middle East turmoil always. Iran is number 5 in the world with coronavirus cases, and that's likely understated in numbers. This has turned into a major challenge to the Iranian government. Initially, the government was reluctant to ban travel, and there was, and of course, the Shia religious center at home, at the beginning of the new year, the Persian New Year, that went ahead. Those celebrations went ahead, and even though that the mosque and the shrine at home is now closed, there are still visits to those shrines. One of the interesting developments, for the first time in 60 years, Iran decided it really did want to have funds for the U.S. It's expected that the U.S. will veto that. The EU is sending aid independently. That just started yesterday, the other day. Mr. Trump did send to Rouhani a letter offering aid, but Khamenei basically rejected it. In fact, at the beginning of the Persian New Year, Khamenei made a speech in which he basically blamed the whole virus on the CIA and foreign terrorists, which reportedly even caused some of his close advisors to kind of downplay the speech, not quite knowing what he was doing. Rouhani, the prime minister, who's a moderate, has been criticized for not doing enough. So there's a lot of blame game going on. And Khamenei has ordered the military, and that includes the Revolutionary Guard, to, quote, take charge over the national response. So I think what we're going to see in Iran is a power play coming out of this. There are presidential elections in another year, but it remains to be seen how this is going to play out. This is still an area where there could be exponential growth, particularly in the countryside, for this virus. In Iraq is very hard, going to be hard hit by this as well. There was a major Shiite pilgrimage to Syria, and Iraqis coming back from Syria have brought the virus with them. We have a government that is dependent on oil, which is now at an 18-year low. We have a parliament that doesn't really, they have a government that doesn't really exist since they ousted the prime minister in November, and there isn't any agreement on a new government. And the U.S. is, as you probably read a couple of weeks ago, is doing the Defense Department has been told to do some planning on how to target Shiite militias within Iraq, much like the assassination of Soleimani, 2 months ago. U.S. military has offered, very public opposition to this, including the commanding general of forces in Iraq. There have been still ongoing withdrawals. We've now closed 3 bases in the month of March, including one in Kirkuk up in the Kurdish area. 3 bases closed just in the month of March. So if you take this with Afghanistan together, quietly, while no one is really paying a whole lot of attention, we are slowly trying to extricate ourselves from Iraq and Afghanistan, in increments. And the last little piece, just to catch you up to date, we know, as you know, there have been elections off and on over the last 2 years to see if you could get a new prime minister and a new government in Israel. The third election did present Likud with a plurality, but Benny Gantz was invited to form a government. But then, as this virus began to take hold, there was a plea for political cooperation, and there is a deal. I think it's about 10 days old now. Netanyahu will be prime minister. His trial has been for corruption and bribery has been postponed until May, and will probably get postponed again. But Benny Gantz put himself forward to be the Speaker of the Parliament, and reportedly under this deal will become the prime minister in a year's time. That may or may not happen, but that is the deal. Very quickly on Latin America and Africa, again, more potential perfect storms. Latin America, while the outbreak started in Brazil, it was actually a case of a businessman from Italy who returned from a conference in Italy and went back to Sao Paulo, and that's kind of where it started. It has taken off in Brazil, Ecuador, and Chile. Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, has been dismissive, and you'll remember that it was, he and his press assistant and others who came up to visit with Trump at Mar-a-Lago about 5 weeks ago, and that has led to a number of people within the U.S. administration, including aides to the vice president and testing of the president and the vice president, who reportedly have tested negative. But Bolsonaro has been tested, and there's conflicting reports about whether he was positive or negative, but he doesn't seem to be showing any symptoms. He's argued that quarantines were absolutely irresponsible, that Brazilians were naturally immune to all of this, and we don't need to worry about it. A lot of people, although his approval rating has gone way down, and on March 18th there were a lot of people hunkering down in their homes anyway, and then banging pots and pans out of the windows in protest that Bolsonaro had to go. But he's not going anywhere. Similarly, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico is another denier. He's now begun to reverse course a little bit with some stay-at-home orders, but for the most part has been out and meeting with large groups and telling people to have fiestas and so on. Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua has basically said, we don't have a problem here. And he was out about a week or so ago in a parade with his wife and Vice President Rosario, leading a love parade through the streets of Managua to demonstrate that love and togetherness were going to defeat this virus, not anything else. And of course, all of this are in countries that have minimal health care and economic capacity to deal with all of this. Venezuela is another crisis in the making. There's no transparency about the situation in the country, but there are 5 million Venezuelans who have fled to neighboring countries, and that's why countries like Ecuador and others, and potentially Colombia, although Colombia has largely closed the border, is that virus is going to spread. And then Africa, again, a place that has not had a lot of virus infections so far, except in South Africa and Cairo, have been where the biggest numbers are. South Africa now the president has declared it a national disaster. The army is enforcing the lockdown. What's happening there is that crowds are basically skeptical, and they're continuing to congregate outside. And there's a huge homeless problem in cities like Johannesburg, and there's no real strategy to deal with that problem. Stay at home. A strategy throughout, the developed world is potentially counterproductive in a lot of these countries. If you look at cities like Lagos in Nigeria, Kinshasa in Congo, Cairo in Egypt, with vast populations and huge chunks of urban poverty and congestion, stay at home means you stay home in a small little place that's filthy and squalid, and there may be 12, 15, 20 people in that home. These are not conditions that are conducive to social distancing by any stretch. And the Ebola experience in many of these countries has meant that instead of isolating, people go out and queue up for supplies because they figured the supplies are not going to be available. So they're hoarding and they're queuing and congregating. They're skeptical, perhaps rightly so, of the ability of the medical system to do anything for them. These countries as well as South Asia, they're all going to need outside help. But at the moment, the outside help, which comes from the developed world, the United States, Canada, Japan, European Union, the G7, the G20, all of those countries are struggling at the moment as well. One final note here, the climate has continued to change. I thought you might find this interesting that this past winter has been the second warmest winter on record, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. And this large red area shows areas where it's, in Moscow, for example, the average daily low temperature was in January was 11 degrees warmer. So it wasn't really much below freezing in Moscow in January, when it usually is significantly lower than that. So this is interesting, as well as it describes the way the world is changing, quite independent of the virus. Last slide, some closing thoughts for me. We're in a world that has this is a life change. It seems to me. A lot of us, and I say us as well, that thought, well, this is a temporary thing. A lot of inconveniences, but these are but for us, these are largely first world problems, right? And we'll hunker down for a while, and there is this notion that, well, everything's going to go back to normal, and very few political leaders, including our president, have not succumbed to this. This will be over quickly, and we'll come charging right back. Well, that's not happening, and it's not going to happen. And even coronavirus deniers are slowly coming around to this. I noticed that the Florida governor this morning decided that, well, there would be a largely shelter-in-place strategy in Florida, although he hasn't done a lockdown yet. It does refocus national priorities. This is consuming our ability to deal with other issues, and it is invoking new fears and vulnerabilities and nationalism and so on. As much as second major point is, as much as people have argued that globalization has kind of reached its peak it is a reality that remains with us and is a driver in all of this. And in fact, it is the technologies of globalization, which we're practicing right here through Zoom, that enables new solutions to things. Some of those solutions are good. Some of them mean loss of privacy and more government control. Those are going to be part of a new normal. Pandemics are encouraging localism. So you even have, even amongst states within the United States and regions amongst other countries. But I think it also shows that populism has its limits. That those who have said, the people are going to figure this all out and governments don't have a role and we're going to limit government and all the rest of it, those kinds of do-it-yourself solutions don't work. So it'll be interesting to see to what extent the populists come out of this more popular than when they started. And last point is that classic politics continues. We still have great power rivalries. This could be an opportunity for cooperation between us and China and us and Russia and so on, but I don't see a whole lot of evidence of that. We do see politicians around the world exploiting this crisis for their own benefit and making choices based on what will suit them politically. So we come down to where we've been since Plato talked about what good governance was, and that is that the crucial variable is always going to be what kind of governance we have in our societies. And at least in some societies, including our own, societies can make choices. And that's my attempt to leave this on a more optimistic note than where most of this has been. And with that, I thank you for your attention. This went a little longer than I expected it to, but hopefully there's some some grist for some good Q&A for the next half hour or so, if there's anybody left. Now, Karen, I think, is turning on audio for everybody. Go ahead, Karen.
I was just going to point out that if you look on your bar, there are 3 written questions submitted for you. 1 chat question. To anybody else, there is an icon to raise your hand. If you have a question, I will unmute this in an orderly manner.
All right. So I have from Paul, a couple of, I guess everybody can read these comments in the chat. From Paul and Denise, Paul Eckstein, who knows of which he speaks. There's an excellent American Experience episode about the 1918 pan-epidemic and pbs.org. And it took reminding us that it took 3 years to work for the 1918 epidemic to work its way through. And I think that's I think that's very wise to remind us that this is not going away anytime soon. And I think if there's a punchline to everything that I was talking about here, is that the world outside the world that we're focused on right now is full of time bombs that have yet to explode, that exponential curves that have yet to take off. And there are still, several billion people on this planet who've not really been touched by this yet, but to pretend that they won't be may be overly optimistic. So if otherwise, I'm open for questions. You can submit questions, or just, I guess, turn your microphone on and turn the mute off when you're not, turn mute on when you're not speaking. But if you are speaking, jump in.
Can you see the written question, Sky? I can read it to you if not.
I'm not seeing written questions.
Okay, this is from Andy Pico. The data.
Oh, I got it now. I got it now.
Okay, good.
All right,
Okay.
Andy Pico. Andres, the data from China is high, and I guess these are just to me, so nobody else can read them. So I'll read the questions. The data from China is highly suspect. I think that's true. The government has suppressed information and the numbers don't track with much of the reporting. Phone data from China provides a lot of the same kind of data that Singapore and Korea does. The phone data indicates a reduction of 20 million in China, and outside news reporting indicates that the death toll in the cities has been much higher, with up to 42,000 in one city alone. And comment. And I think that's true, Andy. We don't know about we don't know what the numbers really are in China. I think there is a consensus, but I'm not an expert here. I'm just based on what I'm reading. That whatever the numbers are, the curve has flattened reasonably well through some draconian social measures. But people are beginning to come back out. There are now reports of, not in subways, but traffic jams in the streets in Beijing and Shanghai and elsewhere, as people ostensibly try to go back to work. But there is this fear that, as I mentioned earlier, that Chinese coming back to the country and Chinese coming back to work, whether there might be another way. But it's certainly appropriate to point out that the data is highly suspect. So thank you for that, Andy.
Let's go to one of the raised hands, and then we can go back to the.
All right, you have raised hands. I don't know that I have those. You have.
Okay, so I have Tom Saponis, and Tom, I've unmuted you. Go ahead.
Yes, I find it interesting that we keep citing Sweden as some kind of success, and in per capita they have essentially the same number of cases as Colorado, maybe even slightly more, and their death rate is twice what it is in Colorado per capita. So, and yet we are alarmed in Colorado, and our governor is even scolding El Paso County, which actually is per capita better than several counties in the state, including the one he resides in.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I wasn't lauding Sweden as a success story. I was just pointing out that they have taken a different tack with respect to lockdown, unlike its neighbors. I mean, you know, Norway and Denmark and Finland have really gone into full lockdown, but Sweden, for its own purposes, have not. So I guess I didn't use the word success. I guess the question is, if they, because of their more lax policies, one would have thought the statistics would have been higher. So that would be my answer to that. I just highlighted it not as a success, but as a different strategy than all of its neighbors. It's not making and yet they're not showing worse results than a lot of their neighbors. That's all. Good point.
All right, let's go to the second written question.
All right. Well, Walter Shaw, should we make anything of the relatively small numbers on infections in the Southern Hemisphere? Yeah, I think two things. I think there are two things that are contributing to that. One is that, of course, they've just been having their summer. And so now they're going to, they're going into their autumn and winter. And so there is this concern that there will be a seasonal, again, there's a big question whether this flu will be seasonal, but whether we'll see an uptick just as the weather changes. But the other issue is that for the most part, it wasn't taken very seriously in the Southern Hemisphere. Governments have been sporadic about it. I do know in some countries, I mean, they may, they're not in lockdown. They are closing borders. Tanzania, for example, I just happen to know this. If anybody coming into the country, whether you're Tanzanian or not, you go into a 14-day quarantine, period. At a government facility at your own expense, period. So there is some responsiveness on that. There isn't very good reporting. And of course, even with our own numbers, we don't really know, without major testing protocols, we don't really know how extensive the virus actually is. And there isn't a lot of testing in these countries. A lot of countries are, you do see a lot more widespread use of masks, which has become a matter of some controversy in this country. But the answer is, I think there are two things. One is you've got bad reporting and denial in some countries in the Southern Hemisphere, and you also have a seasonal issue that may play itself out. So thanks for that. Shall I go on to the next written one, or do you have another one?
I have another raised hand.
All right.
This is Hans Hisken. Hans, I've unmuted you.
Hello, Hans. Hello?
Yeah, I have, I've unmuted him. Okay, move on. I have Nancy Wilson also.
Okay, Nancy, hello? Oh, I do see Hans's written question down here, so maybe I should take that one really quickly.
Okay.
What might be the exit strategy? Will we group people not infected or infected, but the virus is dormant, older people? Will we send young ones back to work first? Should the older citizens stay at home until a vaccine has been found? Well, I think, and so on. If, and Hans, if you're there, if you can hear me, and I'll actually link this to a comment that Paul Eckstein has sent out to people. I think everyone has it. That there's a myth that this thing segregates by, the young and middle aged versus others. We have, and I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests, and I'm not a public affairs guy, so I just know what I read. That there are a lot of cases in which apparently very healthy young people are getting this, and people aged in their 30s, 40s, and 50s are getting this in reasonable percentages as well. So I don't know if that's an exit strategy, and if we all stay home until the virus is that we have a virus on this thing, we may be here until another 15, 18 months. So I'm not sure of that. I don't know that we have a strategy other than try and contain this thing as best as possible, and then develop some long-term behaviors that try and keep it within the capacity of health systems to deal with it. And of course, as this thing explodes in other countries around the world, it's going to quickly overwhelm their healthcare capacities. And I don't know if we're going to be in a position to help. So that's really the huge problem that I expect. So is Nancy still on, or?
Yeah, I'm just having a heck of a time. Let's see.
Now it's,
Can you hear me?
Nancy
There,
just
yes.
unmuted.
Okay, Nancy's unmuted.
Okay, kind of a comment and a question, Sky.
Sure.
I've been in almost daily communication with a friend who's living in Rwanda, has been there for about 9 months, and has decided to just hunker down there. She's got a 2-year visa, and she's been working on a economic development project. Anyway, she's quite remote, well outside Kigali, and has decided kind of her best chances are there. But she's reported that Paul Kagame, of course, has issued stay-at-home orders that are being seriously enforced, and not only stay-at-home orders, but has closed down all the major markets, so people have to use small, very small places to buy their food and that kind of thing. And in fact, this is a local story. I haven't been able to substantiate it any place, but that police have killed 2 people that have defied it, have given them grief about following those orders. So I'm wondering, and so far the most recent data I see from a couple days ago is they have about 80 cases, all in Kigali, and they attribute all of them, or almost all of them, to a flight from Qatar that had a bunch of Rwanda businessmen on it.
Right.
My question is, have you seen, and kind of looking at the issue globally, any places, and I think Rwanda will be interesting to watch, you know, an authoritarian leader who's trying to lock down the country and do what most experts agree is the right thing to do right now. If you've seen or will be seeing cases of these authoritarian rulers who actually have some good success at stopping this virus. We don't know about North Korea, but overall, is it a strategy, or will it be a strategy that works in some places in the world? And I'll mute myself again.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent comment and a question. In most countries, well, the one that's in top of my head is only because I was reading about it this morning. I mean, Pakistan is a classic case. The government wasn't doing a whole lot. The military intervened and is working with regional governments to crack down, and the military is out policing in the streets. And you see that in a lot of other countries that are establishing lockdowns with, you know, that people have heavy fines. In countries like in Asia, where there's technology of monitoring people through, you know, phone, you know, through their iPhones and what have you, that is a you know, that means you don't have to have the police on the streets as much. But if you are, but there are a lot of countries, just not a whole bunch of them that I can name off the top of my head, but there are a lot of countries where people are just skeptical. The government says you're locking down and people are not going out. Now, this is going to be a problem in Pakistan if they're going to start cracking down on clerics who want to hold mosque prayer services on Friday. But there are lots of cases in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, in countries where they are locking down and they're using, you know, heavy presence on the streets if need be to enforce it. I think Argentina is beginning to do that. Argentina just went into a lockdown, if I remember correctly. In countries where you don't have a culture of cooperation, a civic culture of cooperation, and you do go into this mandatory lockdown, then you do see this kind of enforcement. Part of the other thing is that countries that aren't willing to do that, they don't go into the mandatory lockdown. They try and do it through voluntary measures because they don't want to have to enforce it, because that's kind of heavy-handed.
Okay, I think we have several written questions. If you want.
All right, let me just go back to that. Let me see. Last one, well, the next two, Alan Gregory and Wayne, both asked about refugees. Alan about the Turkey-Syria refugee issue, and you know, we now have over 60 million. Wayne points out that we have over 60 million people in refugee camps, and yes, those are squalid, and yes, agencies are trying to deal with it, but it's pretty bad. I haven't actually read about, seen much about that, so I can't answer. I'm gonna answer with a guess here, because I can't answer authoritatively. And Alan and Wayne, if I find out more about this, I'll shoot you a note. One extent is that refugee camps have an advantage, it seems to me, of, quite apart from all of its other problems and the squalor and the congestion and so on, is that you don't have a lot of in and out traffic. And as Nancy just pointed out, you know, a lot of communities are getting this virus, that the first instance, the introduction of it, is coming from a traveler that comes into a community. That's kind of how it started in Brazil. Nancy just pointed out that's kind of how it started in Rwanda. So maybe that's a reason why we haven't seen huge outbreaks of the virus in the refugee camps. But that's all I'm going to say about that, because I'm going to plead ignorance beyond that. There's not a lot of resources outside of what the refugee agencies already have. And I think that's the bigger takeaway for all of us, is that all of the resources that are now being directed at this virus in developing countries are resources that are not available, to deal with these other questions, these other countries and areas as they come up. Let me just say a next word about Gwen's Weddington's comment about asking if I'd comment on the oil crisis between Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. The answer is, yes, this kind of contributed to this. As many of you know, over the past several months, there's been, or maybe more than that, actually, in terms of Saudi Arabia competing with the increase in American shale oil production, trying to squeeze that competition out of the market. And Russia and Saudi Arabia, where it got into a price war, and Saudi Arabia itself decided really to lower prices to try and punish the Russians for trying to for trying to exploit the market in their own way. But then this has simply compounded all of that by cutting demand. People aren't using as much. Factories aren't running. Cars aren't driving as much. The good news is that the planet seems to be breathing a little bit better. But you have this reduction in demand for oil on top of what was already a price war that was driving the price of oil down. And I think those two things together is what's brought us down to about whatever it is today, $18 a barrel or something like that, or $20 a barrel, or whatever the number is. Last written question I have here is from Tom again. Do you believe the Chinese number of essentially no new cases in a country of 1.2 billion? I don't think I believe any Chinese number. As I said before, I think the consensus is that the number of questions, or the number of cases in China is going down. The curve is certainly leveling off. How long it will stay that way, as China tries, Xi Jinping certainly wants to open the country up for business. Whether that will really happen, and if it does, as people go back to work, is that still going to is that going to reintroduce infections that had been dormant? Wuhan was pretty much shut down, but a lot of the country wasn't. And so, no, I don't believe that there are no new cases. I do believe that there are no new reported cases, but that may or may not mean anything. But even that's the same thing about our own numbers, right? We don't know how many cases there are in the United States because we don't have much of a testing protocol. I don't believe I'm a case because I've been sitting here for 3 weeks and no symptoms of anything else, but I've not been tested. And I suspect nobody on this call has probably been tested. And so we don't know whether we're non-systematic carriers or not. Who knows? And that's a question that I think they're all going to deal with. What else do we got, Karen?
We have a live question from either Jim Allen or Laurel McLeod. I can't tell which, but.
All right, Jim and or Laurel.
Can you hear me now? It's Jim Allen.
I can hear you now, just like whatever it was, Verizon or whatever.
This question has to do with the effect of coronavirus or COVID-19 on the EU. 3 aspects of the effect of the virus on the EU. 1, does the Schengen Agreement have to change the free movement of citizens within the 27 countries? Second aspect is, what about the immigrants trying to come into the EU? And the third question is, will the virus be such a strong threat that the future of the EU will be threatened in some way and have to change? So 3 aspects of the effect of the virus on the EU.
Good questions, as always, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
The first one, it was the Schengen Agreement going to have to change. I'm a great believer. I have great faith in bureaucratic and legislative inertia, especially as it comes to the EU. So I think the more likely thing is not that the Schengen Agreement will be scrapped. I mean, people were talking about scrapping the Schengen Agreement long before the coronavirus. But it works for these countries. Now, what I expect will happen is that the 1 month travel restriction will become a 2 month travel restriction or a 3 month travel restriction um, as this thing moves on. And until they really feel, until the countries really feel like they have it under control. And not only do they feel like they have it under control, but that they have it under control to the point that if it begin to see new infections because of increased and renewed travel, that they can deal with it. Until that question can be answered, I don't see how these Schengen travel restrictions shut down at all. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were to go for 3, 4, 5, 6 months in all of that. Second question, does this, but you don't have to change the agreement. You can just agree to, you can agree to amend it, to suspend it. You can, whatever other word you want to do without going back and unraveling a political agreement that you may never get back. The second thing is on immigration. Well, yes, there is no immigration. You can't go from Austria to the Czech Republic. You can't go from France to Germany. Forget France to Britain, which was never in the Schengen agreement, which was not in the Schengen, was not in the EU and not in the Schengen agreement. Norway is totally shut down, even though Norway is in the Schengen agreements. You can't go between Norway and Sweden. So there is no immigration of any sort. There are no flights coming in. There is nobody coming in. In one sense, the immigration issue has gone away, at least for the time being. Those who want to be refugees and go to Europe, they are not moving. The last question was, so what is the impact on the EU overall? That's anybody's guess. That's been the question ever since the European Union was created, 28 years ago. Is whether it will last. I think the punchline is, I think the EU will continue in large measure because this, I'm a multilateralist, so maybe I'm overly optimistic on this. I think one of the things this virus is teaching us, and even as we hunker down in our own communities and neighborhoods and saying our county's better than that county, and our state is better than that state, and we don't want people from some other state coming into our state in the United States. The reality is we are all realizing that we need each other in a way, and we're going to be hungrier for community when this is over, rather than less hungry for it. We also are going to understand the need for cooperation, not in all things, but in basic things. And we're also going to understand that that economic recovery from all of this, which is going to be a huge challenge for every country in the world, from richest to the poorest, none of us is going to recover by ourselves. It's going to take a restoration of global supply chains. It's going to take a restoration of reduced tariff barriers. And all of the things that really had motivated the creation of the EU in the first place. So no, in the long run, I don't see the EU dying as a result of the coronavirus. It may get a new lease on life, and nothing else, bureaucratic inertia will carry it through. How's that for an on the one hand and on the other hand response?
All right. Hey, we have a live question from Lee Bittner, and Lee, you are unmuted.
Hi, Lou.
Have any thoughts as to what form our national elections will take this fall? Will it be write-in or what?
I'll tell you what I'd like to see, which is something for which there is not yet a political consensus, is that we have some form of remote voting. The notion, it just seems to me that come November, which by the way is, the beginning of another flu season, even the regular flu, that the ability for us, for people to stand in long queues for people to come into voting places, for people to congregate to deal with all of this, on one single day. I just don't see how that happens. So it seems to me that, Colorado's got one of the best voting systems around, and we just switched that to, you get in your car and you put it in the mail, or you get in your car and you drive it to a box and you drop it in. And yes, you have to have people to enter these things and code these things, but it doesn't create as much congregation of people as a regular voting system. I think the bigger challenge, interestingly, is that you don't have any rallies. You may not have any rallies. And, unless we pretend that this thing is all going to be over by, after Labor Day, the usual campaign season, which, many people typically didn't start paying much attention until after Labor Day. But let's just say Labor Day to November, those 2 months, that's a season of heavy political organization and mobilization and face-to-face and handshakes and all the rest of it. And I don't see how that happens. So I think we're in for a social media driven election campaign and at least a much more remote electoral process. And if that is not necessarily good news, because as we know, and this is not world affairs, this is U.S. domestic affairs, but these are my comments. Social media can be manipulated easily. We've been there before. So that's going to put a premium on all of us being careful about what we listen to and believe, and dealing with others who have views that are clearly fake news or whatever you want to call it, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and all the rest of it. And being able to engage, but to engage remotely. So that's going to be a huge challenge and an opportunity for mischief on a lot of quarters. And then the second question is whether or not we can get our act together on voting remotely in all 50 states, and how this will play itself out as states deal with everything else. Right now, that's not. I'm sure it's on the secretaries of states of the 50 states' to-do list, but it's not something that's going to get done this week. So excellent question, Lee. I wish I had a better answer, but those are my initial thoughts on it.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but if you all can join me virtually or otherwise in thanking Sky for making our first webinar happen today. Thank you so much, Sky. I think this came up.
My pleasure. And my apologies. I will clean up the typos on these slides and send them to Karen, and Karen can send them out to anybody who wants them. I'm embarrassed by the typos on this thing, but and obviously this was an attempt to do something kind of around the world, and you've all asked some great questions that I don't really have all the answers to, but then we all don't know anything, and that's everything, and that's why we do this. So stay well, stay healthy, and stay informed, and keep supporting the World Affairs Council.
Yes, and I just want to announce that our next webinar will be next Wednesday, same time. We'll be hosting Steve Recca, and the title of his webinar will be "How Do You Spy When the World is Shut Down?"
Good one.
Yeah.
Good one.
So program about the intelligence community and the coronavirus.
Right. All right. Well, thank you all, and have a good rest of your day. Stay warm, stay healthy, and